You push a button on your wall, and within 20 minutes, your living room is a balmy 72 degrees. You pull on a soft fleece hoodie, grab a steaming mug of hot cocoa, and watch the snow blanket the streets outside through a double-paned glass window. If the roads get too bad, you'll just order groceries to your door. If the power blinks, you've got blankets, flashlights, and a smartphone with enough downloaded movies to last a week. Winter, for the modern human, is an aesthetic. It's a season of cozying up, complaining about shoveling the driveway, and waiting for spring while binge-watching your favorite shows. It is comfortable. It is safe. Now, let's strip all of that away. Imagine no thermostat. No insulated walls. No synthetic fleece, no hot cocoa, no supermarkets, and no glass windows. Instead, imagine standing at the mouth of a damp cave in Western Europe 34,000 years ago. The horizon is a brutal, monochromatic wasteland of jagged ice and endless tundra. The wind howling across the plains doesn't just make your ears sting, it carries a deep, biting cold that can freeze exposed human flesh solid in less than 15 minutes. Your clothing is a heavy, stiff layout of cured mammoth hide and deer fur, stitched together with dried animal sinew. Your stomach is completely empty because the berries, roots, and small game you relied on 3 months ago are now buried under 4 feet of permafrost. And to make matters worse, the sun, the only source of warmth and light you have, is barely scraping across the horizon for a few miserable hours a day before plunging the world into a 14-hour abyss of freezing darkness. This wasn't a temporary survival scenario for our ancestors. This was 6 months out of every single year. When we think about early Homo sapiens or our Neanderthal cousins, we usually picture them in a perpetual summer, chasing mammoths across green valleys under a golden sun. But for vast stretches of human history, particularly during the last glacial maximum, winter wasn't just a season. It was a brutal, unrelenting antagonist. It was a cyclical apocalypse that arrived every year with absolute certainty, demanding a perfect score on the test of survival. One mistake, one night of letting the fire die, one bad hunting trip, and your entire bloodline ended right there in the snow. Which raises a massive, fascinating question that historians and archaeologists have spent decades trying to piece together: what did ancient humans actually do during the winter? How did a tropical primate, born in the warm savannas of Africa with no fur, no fangs, and no natural insulation, manage to migrate into the frozen northern hemisphere and not only survive the deadliest winters in Earth's history, but actually thrive? To understand the sheer genius of their survival, we have to go back to the absolute core of the winter problem: energy management. In the modern world, we think of winter as a time to slow down, but for ancient humans, winter was a high-stakes chess match played against thermodynamics. Every single calorie mattered. On a freezing winter day, the human body burns an astronomical number of calories just trying to maintain its core temperature. If you are shivering, your body is working on overdrive, screaming for fuel. But where do you get fuel when the world is dead? You can't gather berries. You can't dig up frozen soil for roots. The migratory birds have flown south, and the small mammals are hibernating deep underground. The strategy for early humans during the winter wasn't to fight nature head-on, it was to completely re-engineer their lifestyle around the concept of behavioral hibernation. First, let's talk about their homes, because our ancestors were master architects of insulation long before the invention of drywall. In regions where deep caves weren't available, like the vast plains of ancient Ukraine and Russia, humans couldn't just pitch a tent made of sticks. The wind would tear it apart in seconds. Instead, they built what archaeologists call mammoth bone huts. Imagine a massive, circular structure constructed entirely from the skeletal remains of woolly mammoths. The foundation was lined with heavy mammoth skulls to anchor the building against Arctic gales. The walls were framed using interlocking mammoth ribs and tusks, woven together like a giant, prehistoric jigsaw puzzle. But bones alone don't stop the wind. Our ancestors took layers of heavy animal hides, soaked them to make them pliable, and draped them over the bone framework. Then, they did something incredibly brilliant: they packed the outside of the structure with thick layers of turf, soil, and snow. Snow is actually a phenomenal natural insulator because it traps air pockets. Inside these mammoth bone lodges, packed tightly with several families and a central hearth fire, the temperature could stay remarkably stable, even when a blizzard was raging outside. But shelter is only half the battle. You can have the best house in the world, but if you don't have food, the winter will still claim you. This is where prehistoric food preservation completely changes how we view ancient intelligence. For a long time, popular culture portrayed early humans as simple-minded hunters who killed an animal, ate until they were stuffed, and then starved until the next kill. But you cannot survive an Ice Age winter with that mindset. Our ancestors were food scientists. In the late autumn, as the temperature began to drop, tribes would go on massive, coordinated megafauna hunts. They weren't just hunting for the week, they were harvesting for the entire winter. When they brought down a massive creature like a bison or a horse, the real work began. They didn't just feast. They sliced the meat into razor-thin strips and hung them over smoking fires or exposed them to the dry, freezing winds. By removing the moisture, they created prehistoric jerky, lightweight, calorie-dense, and completely resistant to rotting. In colder regions, they utilized the landscape itself as a giant, communal freezer. Archaeologists have discovered deep pits dug into the permafrost beneath ancient dwellings. These weren't garbage dumps, they were ice cellars. Humans would pack these pits with meat, fat, and bone marrow, seal them with heavy stones to keep out scavengers like foxes and wolverines, and let the frozen earth preserve their food supply for months. But storing the food was only part of the winter equation. The real challenge of those frozen months wasn't just physical survival, it was psychological. When the blizzard outside drops the visibility to zero and the sun refuses to show its face for weeks on end, what do you do with your mind? This is where the true social evolution of humanity took place. Inside those mammoth bone huts, huddled around a central hearth that was never allowed to go out, the concept of a community was forged. Imagine 20 or 30 people packed into a space no larger than a modern two-car garage. You are sitting shoulder to shoulder with your family, your in-laws, your tribal elders, and a dozen children. The air is thick with the smell of burning wood, melting animal fat, and drying fur. Outside, the wind screams like a dying predator. Inside, the silence is heavy. If you don't find a way to occupy the human brain, friction happens. Cabin fever in an Ice Age camp didn't just mean getting annoyed with your neighbor, it could lead to violence, fracturing the tribe, which meant certain death for everyone. To prevent this, ancient humans turned winter into the ultimate season of craftsmanship and culture. During the long summer and autumn days, there was no time for artistic expression. You were moving, hunting, gathering, and running for your life. But winter provided the luxury of time, provided you had enough food stored. Under the dim, flickering amber light of the hearth fire, our ancestors became master artists. They took the bones and ivory of the animals they had eaten and began to carve. They made intricate bone needles, smoothly polished buttons, and beautifully detailed handles for their tools. But they also made art for the sake of art. This is the season when the famous Venus figurines were carved, small, stylized ivory and stone statues of women that have been found all across Europe and Asia, dating back tens of thousands of years. They carved flutes out of bare bones, drilling precise holes to create musical scales. In the dead of winter, deep inside a frozen landscape, the dark interior of a bone hut would echo with the haunting, beautiful sounds of the world's first musical instruments. They played music, they crafted jewelry out of wolf teeth, and they wore clothes decorated with thousands of meticulously drilled ivory beads. They used beauty as a weapon against the crushing bleakness of the cold. And just like the long nights of the summer, winter nights were the ultimate training ground for language. This was when the elders passed down the survival blueprints of the tribe. Around the winter fire, a child wouldn't just hear stories about spirits or monsters, they would listen to detailed, hours-long oral maps of the landscape. They would memorize the exact location of a hidden cave 50 miles away, the behavior of a river when the ice melts in the spring, and the precise tracking patterns of a herd of reindeer. Winter was the prehistoric university. However, no matter how much food you stored or how many stories you told, there always came a moment when the winter pushed back. The stores would run low. The ice cellars would begin to empty. And when that happened, ancient humans had to face the most terrifying prospect of the season, the winter hunt. Hunting in the summer was about strategy, speed, and positioning. Hunting in the winter was pure, unadulterated desperation. When a tribe was forced to leave the safety of their insulated huts in the dead of January, they were entering a world where the environment itself was trying to kill them. Walking through 3 feet of snow is exhausting. It drains your caloric reserves at a terrifying pace. To combat this, some ancient groups developed the earliest prototypes of snowshoes, binding wide framework branches and leather to their feet to distribute their weight and glide across the drifts. But tracking prey in the winter was a double-edged sword. On one hand, the snow made tracking incredibly easy. A wounded deer or a migrating elk left a blatant trail of deep footprints and bright red blood against the white canvas of the tundra. You couldn't lose your prey. But on the other hand, you left a trail too. And you weren't the only hungry thing out there. During Ice Age winters, apex predators like the cave hyena, the cave lion, and packs of massive dire wolves were experiencing the exact same famine as humans. They were starving, desperate, and hunting for anything that moved. A human hunting party moving slowly through a blizzard wasn't just a group of predators chasing a deer, they were potential targets being watched from the tree line by eyes that could see perfectly in the dark. If a hunter got separated from the group, slipped on a patch of black ice, or twisted an ankle in a hidden crevice, the snow wouldn't just hide their body, it would erase their tracks before the tribe could ever find them. If the hunters did manage to find a herd, the tactics changed entirely. In the summer, you could chase an animal until it collapsed from heat exhaustion. In the winter, the animals had thick winter coats and were adapted to the cold. So, humans used the snow as a weapon. They would intentionally drive a heavy animal, like a bison or a woolly rhino, toward deep snowdrifts or frozen ravines. The heavy, hoofed animals would plunge into the deep drifts, becoming completely immobilized by their own weight. Once trapped in the white powder, unable to turn or kick effectively, the human hunters would close in with their stone-tipped spears, using cooperation and gravity to bring down a giant that could feed the tribe for another month. But what happened when the hunt failed? What happened when the blizzards lasted not for days, but for weeks on end, making it physically impossible to step outside the cave or the hut? This is where we look into the darkest, most resilient side of human nature. When the food ran out completely, ancient humans didn't just lie down and accept their fate. They adapted their biology. Studies on ancient human bones show signs of seasonal stress, periods where growth completely stopped due to severe malnutrition, leaving permanent markers called Harris lines in their skeletal structure. Our ancestors survived periods of starvation that would cause a modern human to go into organ failure. They chewed on cured leather hides just to get a trace of collagen. They broke open old animal bones that had been sitting in the corner of the hut for months, using stones to smash them apart so they could suck out the absolute last drops of dried, fatty marrow hidden deep inside the bone cavity. They endured. They sat in the dark, feeling the cold slowly creeping closer as the firewood ran low, wrapping themselves in every single piece of fur they owned, pressing their bodies together into a massive, breathing wall of collective heat. They knew that every sunrise they lived to see was a step closer to the thaw.